Sarah Richardson was born in the small village of Ramsey, northwest of Cambridge. She met a much older man, a labourer, William Colwell, when they were both living down in Sussex. And they had a couple of children, a couple of daughters together before they got married, and moved to Redhill. And they ran a lodging house there, housed about 30 low-paid labourers and unemployed people. And they went on in Grove Road. And they went on to have 5 more children together over the next 5 or 6 years. Sarah went through a cycle of constant pregnancies and births. They lost one of their children, a little girl, when she was just 2 years old. And their 8th child, the 8th child had just been born, a son, when they seemed to have got religion, and they got all of their surviving children baptised on the same day at St Matthew's Church in Redhill. Their son, William, was only 2 months old. He was probably already showing signs of illness, and 2 months later he too had died. It was really the beginning of a tragic cycle for Sarah of pregnancy and nursing and then death, and she had to bury her all of her next 3 children, St Mary's Reigate. So they all died when just a few months old. They weren't falling ill for no reason. Her husband, maybe even unbeknownst to him, had syphilis, and he was getting towards the quite advanced stages of that condition, and that was the reason that the children were all of very poor health and dying off very young. They left the lodging house and took a cottage, what's called the Roundabout, a little ramshackle collection of cottages on Earlswood Common, and they brought in a lodger, Charles Lawrence, the father of our man, Edward Lawrence, to help pay the bills. At some point, William Colwell's condition got unmanageable. He would have been having delusions, hallucinations, probably would have been very aggressive, unpredictable, and he would have eventually begun to lose his strength, lose control of his body. And at some point, very soon after they moved into their new cottage, he went off probably to the Reigate workhouse infirmary. And Sarah and Charles Lawrence moved off together to start a new life for themselves in Esher, in a little, what's now suburb of Esher, called West End at the time. Charles was a labourer, as William had been, and he probably worked on a local farm. Not all of Esher had developed into houses at that point in time. And they got married, bigamously, actually, in 1895. On Christmas Day, when we have quite a lot of Christmas Day marriages, because for working people, for some people, it was the only day they could actually have off each year. There was no such thing as weekends at the time, and so if they were, they'd have to work for their master or work on their farm all week long. And it was 2 months after Edward had been born. Now, Sarah actually claimed to be a widow in the service, but she wasn't at that point. William was still in Reigate, but just a couple of years later he was admitted to the asylum at Brookwood, and he died there of what they called general paralysis of the insane. He would have been completely bedridden, his muscles would have wasted away, he would have been unable to speak and to feed himself. Edward grew up with his parents in Esher, their only child, and he became a gardener. He'd probably left school at the age of 13. Unfortunately, his mother died, Sarah died when Edward was just 14. And very, very soon after that, Charles and Edward moved away. We don't know where they went for a couple of years, but we do know that they came to Burgh Heath in 1913 or 1914. There was a widow living there, Phoebe Muggeridge. She had a child quite young in life, and then she had met a widower, Frederick Muggeridge, who had already had many children. There was quite an age gap between them. Phoebe was only just older than Frederick's eldest son at the time. They had a long marriage together. They had four or five children together until Frederick passed away at the age of 72. They lived at what was number 4 Wheeler's Cottages. It was a terrace of 6 cottages that ran sort of east-west, parallel to the Reigate Road, on the green at Burgh Heath. You wouldn't have seen it as you drove past. You wouldn't on the Reigate Road. You wouldn't have seen it from the other side of the pond at Burgh Heath, and for that reason we don't have any photographs of it or any postcards, just the houses that surround them. But where their house was is now the back garden of number 11 and 12 on the green. After Frederick died, Phoebe brought in lodgers to help pay the bills, and it was Charles and Edward that came in to live with her. A few months later, when war broke out, Edward signed up to join the army. He was enlisted on the 2nd of September 1914, one of the busiest recruiting days of the war, and he joined one of our local regiments, the East Surrey Regiment. He wasn't quite 19 years old, which was the age you had to be to go and fight overseas, so he added just a couple of, well, he could have added just a couple of months to his age, but he actually added 2 years, claimed to be 20. He was quite tall for the time, 5'9½". He worked outdoors, so he probably looked quite weather-beaten and older than he was. And he joined them at their barracks at Kingston. Now, unlike many of our men that volunteered at this time, he didn't go overseas straight away. He was actually kept on the home front until 1916, and we don't really know why. But in January 1916, he married the widow, Phoebe Muggeridge. He claimed to be 28, he was only 20, and she claimed to be 45, and she was probably at least 55 at that point. So it was quite an age gap between them. But then in the summer, he did finally go to France. He was with the 7th East Surrey Regiment on the home front, and he would have gone to join them. But one of our other Surrey regiments, the West Surreys, the Queens, suffered some very bad casualties in a gas attack in the spring of 1916, which claimed the life of another Burgh Heath man, George Mitchell. And one of the men from the East Surreys that went out as a direct replacement for them was Leonard Bowler, who we've commemorated already, who was Phoebe Muggeridge's step-grandson. He was actually older than Edward, which shows how much of an age gap that there was there. Edward went out in the summer to join the 8th Queens. They'd suffered, after the gas attack, they'd suffered more casualties on the Somme. So Edward probably spent a month or so in an infantry-based depot before joining them as a replacement. They had lost something like 600 men in the fighting on the Somme. The whole brigade were withdrawn for rest. They were sent up to quite a quiet period, quite a quiet part of the line of that period, up by Luz in northern France, where units were all sent to recuperate from the Battle of the Somme. And he was probably with them when they were moved up there. They spent the whole of almost the whole of the rest of 1916 in that area, and then through into 1917. There is, unfortunately, Edward's service records haven't survived. There's a little bit of uncertainty about whether he really was with them for all of that time, so I won't go into too much detail. But in June of 1917, they moved north into Belgium, near the town of Ypres, the low-lying medieval market town. It was surrounded by high ground all around. Over sort of that way, looking west from Ypres, looking east from Ypres, was the high ground of the Messines Ridge. And at the beginning of July, we blew 500 tons of high explosives under that ridge to stun the German defenders, and we advanced through those shocked men, the corpses lying all over the ground. A great victory for the British and Commonwealth troops that went over the top that day. And Edward's battalion were actually in reserve for that particular engagement. It was such a success that hardly any of the reserves actually went into battle that day. And after that, they stayed in the Ypres salient and then took part in the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres. They were still over that sort of way, just on the shoulder of the high ground, the Gelleveld Plateau, which was strategically important. Wasn't realised quite how important it was until the attacks all started to fail. But just on the right shoulder of that little village called Klein Zillebecker, and Edward's battalion fought there that day. They did very well, actually. They reached all of their objectives that day, but they did suffer some casualties. And it's likely that Edward was one of the men that was wounded or missing that day. But he wasn't missing for long, and his wound can't have been that bad, as he was probably transferred to the 7th Battalion of the Queens after returning to action just a few days later. They suffered some really bad casualties about 2 weeks after the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres, and they needed reinforcements from all kinds of different places. Edward's battalion were already quite well stocked with men, so they probably didn't need him, so he and many others would have gone to join the 7th Queens instead. They were so badly decimated that they were pulled out of the line for a period of rest and training. They were trained in the new methods of attack. We'd learnt a lot of lessons from the early fighting in the Third Battle of Ypres. We'd learnt that we weren't attacking trench lines, we were actually attacking series of strong points. And so the whole attacking organisation was devolved from these large formations into small units of platoons, each learning how to leapfrog each other and to outflank and envelop these concrete pillboxes that were the main obstacle on the battlefront. So they were trained in these methods of attack and organisation. And they were still training through September when the second sort of major phase of the Third Battle of Ypres started under Second Army. General Plumer's famous bite and hold attacks on a very limited front with a large number of men, extensive artillery preparation, and with a limited objective, just 1,500 yards at a time, a series of very small steps that would take us eventually up to the village of Passchendaele, up on the high ground over that way. And they were in camp, and they heard the good news coming through, and they heard the numbers of prisoners that were being taken under these very successful advances, and it must have really raised their spirits after everything they'd been through. Towards the end of October, beginning of October, sorry, the weather turned again. It had been awful in August, it had been good in September, which allowed these advances to happen, but it just started to turn again at the beginning of October. The rain started to come. The generals in charge of the army knew that time was very short. Sir Douglas Haig, however, was keen to press on despite the objections of his subordinates. And so the attacks would go ahead. The next phase was planned for the 9th of October. It was supposed to be the capture of the village of Passchendaele itself. And unfortunately, the bad weather meant that they reined in their ambitions a little bit. Just an attempt to get halfway to the village. And even that they didn't manage to achieve. The guns were unable to be brought up because of the condition of the grounds. They didn't have a good barrage. They didn't have enough time to prepare and get men in place. And it all went wrong. So the next attack was already in the calendar for the 12th of October, so they thought that they would try again in what would become known as the First Battle of Passchendaele. And Edward's battalion were to take part in that. They were on the northern flank of the battlefield, the village of Poelkapelle. They would be sort of over here, as it were, and then Passchendaele would just be over that sort of way. Now, the Australians and New Zealanders were going to assault the village of Passchendaele itself, and the job of 18th Division, in which Edward was in, was to secure the left flank of the battlefield, and they were going to advance across this gently rising stretch of open ground, a spur that led up to the main high ground over there. There were no major trench systems to conquer there, but there were an awful lot of strong points, a lot of these concrete pillboxes and short sections of shell holes that had been turned into defensive positions. There was very little cover. The ground condition was absolutely awful after the rain, so it was going to be a tough ask for anybody to achieve that. The 7th Queens made their way up to the battlefield on the 11th of October, which is the date of Edward's official dates of death. However, all the dead men from that day are accounted for, and it's not believed that Edward is really amongst them. They were to be in support of the other 3 battalions in their brigade. So on the left of their attack, they had the Royal West Kents, in the middle the Buffs, the East Kent Regiment, on the right were the East Surreys, and then the Queens would be waiting behind the village of Poelkapelle in reserve, ready to go in should they be needed. There were 3 designated strong points that each battalion was given. First they had to capture them, and then they had to turn them into their own set of defensive strong points in case the Germans started to counterattack. And the middle one of those was called Mernier House. And it was seen to be the most important one. It was on a slight rise in the ground. It was just 4 or 5 metres higher than everything around it, but it was quite an advantage on such a flat landscape. And that objective was given to the middle battalion, the Buffs. But the Queens, in support, were also tasked to help them. If they couldn't capture it, then the Queens were to go in and help them capture it. If the Buffs had captured it, the Queens would be ready to counter-attack in case the Germans tried to take that strong point back. The troops went over the top at dawn. The light was apparently just right, but it was already starting to rain. They didn't have very good artillery support as they went over. The same problem that had afflicted the battle just a few days earlier existed here. The guns could not be brought up in time. The ones that could just sank into the mud as they fired and gradually became less accurate. The heavy shells of the heavy artillery just were heavy enough that they just plopped straight into the mud and burrowed down many feet into the ground and didn't explode. As the troops advanced, their machine guns jammed with mud and were useless, whereas the Germans sighted in their dry positions and their concrete shelters, their machine guns worked absolutely perfectly. Tank support was ineffective. They just couldn't get forward on the ground. So as soon as these men left their trenches, they were already in trouble, coming under fire from all of the strong points that they were supposed to be attacking. And the attack almost broke down after about 200 yards or so. It wasn't known that this was the situation. Communication on the battlefield was very difficult, and so the commanders had no idea for several hours exactly what was happening. And so the Queens were held back, and they didn't go into battle just then. As the morning progressed and the optimistic reports they'd received from some wounded men and some optimistic aerial observers started to lose their credence as the situation on the ground became much clearer, the commanders started to think instead about turning their abortive attack into defence, because the Germans were inevitably going to be counter-attacking. They chose a line for a barrage to be called down in an emergency, and they moved the Queens up immediately behind the village of Poelcapelle and brought forward battalions from a reserve brigade either side of them to make a stiff line that the Germans wouldn't be able to push back. The afternoon was confusion. Diaries from most of the units that took part in the attack for the brigade are either fragmentary or don't exist at all. It's very difficult to piece together exactly what happened. We do know in the morning that the Buffs had come up against Mernier House. They hadn't got anywhere near it. They had been described almost as surrendering at one point. The situation was that bad. And the Queens were probably sent in the afternoon at about 4 o'clock to try and take Mernier House. But they had no success at all, and the attack just stalled where it was. And they were eventually pulled back off the battlefield, and they battened down the hatches for the night. And that ended the first day of the Battle of Passchendaele. There were something like 1,500 casualties in the division that Edward was in. They gained about 100 yards in total. Elsewhere, the Australians and the New Zealanders just could not get through the mud, the impassable ground of the Ratherbeek Valley by Passchendaele. They had barbed wire 50 yards deep they had to contend with. The commanders who'd sent them in hadn't quite realised the seriousness of the defences there. They would rectify that in future, but it was far too late for that day, 100 years ago tomorrow. Edward was one of the missing men those days, and he was later confirmed to have been killed in action, probably when the Queens advanced in the afternoon. He's commemorated on the Tyncott Memorial to the missing, on the Roll of Honour in the Burgh Heath War Memorial Hall, here on the wooden panels in the Memorial Chapel, and in the All Saints Book of Men who served overseas. He was 21 years old.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them. Thank you very much to all of you for coming here today to remember this very young man, 21.